Hello, and welcome to a lovely morning in Average Joe's Moto Garage. Today we're covering a basic rebuild and service of the forks on a Honda CB900 or 919 Hornet made from 2002 to 2007. Now, I've worked on a lot of forks before, but I had never worked on I had worked on street bike forks, but like on my own vintage street bike that has essentially no external adjustment, period. And they're just damping rod forks. There's nothing special about that, but I frequently mess with stuff like this. Is my XR 650R. I have a Honda 450 behind that. And I've serviced all the suspension on these things and lots of other bikes in the past. And the main thing is that I've learned is dirt bike forks, especially anything in the motocross realm, is about what's standard on a motocross bike is considered extremely sophisticated on your average street super bike. So when I saw this bike used conventional forks, they're not even upside down forks, and their only adjustment are spring preload and rebound, I'm like, okay, I haven't done this fork before and I don't have a service manual, but I'm pretty sure I can handle it. I was able to get like all the correct fluid specs and fluid levels and volume and blah blah blah. Ultimately I was like, how could I mess this up, right? So I've already finished the first fork leg, and now I decided, because I couldn't really find a ton of information on the internet regarding rebuilding these, that maybe I should just do it. So here we are, welcome in my tiny little garage shop, and I'm going to show you how to rebuild a Honda 919 fork. I'll do a quick bit here to show you everything you're going to need to do the job. Otherwise, let's get down to it. If you've never done suspension period before, I think you're gonna find that this is pretty easy. If you've worked on suspension before, like on motocross bikes, this is gonna be really simple. There's just like one or two little nuances that I've never seen on another fork that I was really glad to run into here, experience it as a problem for myself, and be like, how did that work? Where did I go wrong? And then figure it out. Now it's like, oh, well, that makes perfect sense. Okay, so if you're getting into a conventional fork, because I'm sure this is on other bikes other than the 919 Hornet, this is probably on a bunch of 90s bikes, to be honest. Yeah, if you're diving into this, you'll find it kind of similar to like what's on this XR 650R here, a conventional fork, but what's called a conventional fork with a single cartridge design. But this single cartridge is peanuts. This is easy, simple stuff compared to what's even going on inside this KYB fork on this XR 650R. So let's show you everything that you need here and get down to it.
All right, so we'll make a quick run across the table of everything we need to do the job. Probably don't need a tape measure for just seals, but we have it if we're doing a good fork service, so we can check the stock fork springs free length, which is when it's out of the fork. If it's shorter than it's supposed to be, the spring is fatigued and needs to be replaced. Bushings and seals, need a drain pan, fork seal driver. You probably don't need this cartridge holder, but I'm a fan personally. Made my life a little easier. A O-ring or pick tool. What size is this? A 6mm Allen wrench. A few different wrenches, specifically two 14mm are what you really need, and the crescent's just extra. I'm a fan of damping rod holding tools. We'll see what we need that for later. A 24mm or 15/16 end wrench. I got an extra end wrench just for some leverage. I'm a big fan of the long flat blade tuning screwdrivers. A little bit of grease. This stuff says O-ring, right? So I figured it's got to be good for anything rubber that we're dealing with. Soft jaws in general, gotta have them, but if you can get a set of these fork or a damping rod specific, we'll just say suspension specific jaws for your vise. As you can see, it holds the fork nicely and angled and makes it easy to get to everything. I can invert the fork. When you have just the cartridge out, you can set the body aside and just hold on to the damping rod in these. Let's see. And then we got a oil level setting tool. That's one of a couple ways that it's mentioned that we should set the fork oil level and volume. Well, they give you a volume and a level measurement, so I just try and find a happy place between the two. Just have a Sharpie, keep a note of where everything is in your fork. Gotta have some safety glasses. Suspension cleaner is great. This is obviously specific for the application, but don't get too caught up in that. You could use brake cleaner if you want. I wouldn't get too crazy with it. It's definitely nice to have the right stuff, you know. This is the recommended oil for this job, which is a 10 weight fork oil. So I just got Honda's recommendation straight out of the manual. A few rags and a way to measure your oil when you're putting it in. Ratio right seems to work pretty good. So, all right, let's get down to actually doing the job.
All right, now you've seen everything we need, so let's get down to it. Step one, this is right where the nuance that I was talking about starts, right at the beginning. We're usually gonna want to check where our clicker adjustments, in this case there are no clickers, it's just turns. But this fork at the time that I'm starting this has 2.5 turns of adjustment in the rebound. It was set at around 1 to 1 1/4 turns out. In a normal situation, if you're working on a dirt bike fork or any sort of twin cartridge fork, everybody will tell you, hey, set that clicker all the way out. Well, that was my one mistake when doing the other fork leg. We actually want to set this screw all the way in, and I will explain why. The quick and dirty of it is when you're reassembling this inner cartridge, anybody that's done a fork before knows when you're tying the damping rod to the cartridge, there's you basically thread the cartridge onto the damping rod and then you do a tightening of that lock nut. Well, if you set this screw all the way out, we'll be able to see the actual needle of the rebound pin. Where you set that at the assembly of the fork sets where the cartridge bottoms out on the damping rod, because wherever you set it, that's how deep you're able to thread the cartridge in onto the damping rod and then set the nut. So if I set this screw, if I have this apart and I run that screw way in, that's going to completely change the point that the cartridge attaches to the damping rod in terms of where it bottoms out and the lock nut gets tightened. I found that out the hard way by doing this the old-fashioned way, like you would on like a Shawa twin chamber motocross fork. So this has 2.5 range of adjustment. We are going to set that all the way in as 2.5 from tight. From there, we have spring preload adjustment, which is a 14mm on top of the fork that just screws in and out, has a lot of adjustment. That we will set all the way out. From there, we remove the cap using our 15/16 or 24mm wrench. We have the fork this whole time put in basic old Harbor Freight vise, but with a set of suspension jaws that are made of aluminum, I believe. These are just the basic old Tux ones, and I've used these for countless different forks and fork rebuilds and changes I've made on my own bikes and blah blah blah. They're great, it's all you need. So we'll get that loose. I don't need to initially make it that bad and take it all the way out and expose the O-ring. What I want to do now is flip the fork over while the O-ring is still sealed in the top. I haven't turned it out that much. With all the tabs on these forks, it's a little more awkward than on a dirt bike fork to get it in the jaws nicely. Anyway, there it is. 6mm Allen wrench goes right in the end of the fork. I've already broken this loose, but when I first went to do it on these forks, they were extremely tight, and I couldn't really get the short end of the Allen wrench through the axle hole to work, to like get the leverage I needed. So I had to go the long way, and then this is a questionable method depending on who you talk to, but just, you know, take a wrench, get some more leverage, put it in the boxed end, and that got me what I needed to break that loose. So let's now take the fork out of the vise, get the top off, and we're going to take a look at our oil. How bad is it? So next, let's keep our soft jaws in the jaws of the actual vise. We'll flip this over. Just place it right side up again. All right, so with the fork right side up in the vise again, we got the bottom nut just cracked loose. Pull this off. See, now that O-ring's exposed. From here, I'm just gonna put my hand on the bottom of the fork just to support it. I don't think it's not gonna fall out or anything, but it's worth it, I think. Okay, it's loose. Now from right here, this just slides down and just pull down the inner fork tube. This is where I like that damping rod I was talking about, because there is a nut right here underneath that blue cap. It's another 14 millimeter like I was talking about. I got a skinny one here that I'll stick in, but for extra convenience, I like to use the damping rod holding tool, pull down on this. You can't actually see the spring in this one because I think we have aftermarket fork springs that are shorter, and we're just using a spring spacer here. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure this is aftermarket. So we'll just pull down on the spring spacer, insert the damping rod tool. That will just expose a little nut right here. From there, put the skinny wrench on, the black nut that's under the cap, and then the top cap, you actually are going to put it on the spring preload adjuster, because at this point, the blue cap actually is just going to spin independently. With the cap not thread into the lower tube anymore, this is just spinning on the preload adjuster. So that might actually be a little trickier. A good reason to have the damping rod tool is because as I put this back in the vise, so I can actually get the leverage to pull on these two without holding it between my legs, the fork can't keep sliding down. Big benefit. So you just break that loose. Now we unthread the cartridge, the rebound adjuster part of the cartridge. See, it's this long tube that comes out. Right there on the end, there's a needle. Now that goes into a cone type hole down at the bottom of the cartridge. And as you adjust that screw in or out, you're changing how much oil is able to readily flow through that hole. This is what I was talking about, the importance of where you set the rebound adjuster when you disassemble, because this is that nut that I was talking about that sets the adjustment length of how far the cap threads into the damping rod. I was calling this a cartridge. It would be more proper to consider it a cartridge on other types of forks. Maybe someone's going to tell me that I shouldn't be calling it that at all. Either way, the cap that has the damping part, the actual damping rod needle, goes down into said damping rod. So we'll set that out of the way to get clean. So now with the cap out of the way, still have the fork in the vise. There's no tension on this anymore. Just pull out the damping rod tool. This is a spring seat. Here's a spring spacer. I'm just setting these on some rags I got over here. Now it's important to keep these in order of their orientation the whole time that you're doing this. You don't really need to remove this nut. So from here, it's time, I think, for us to make a move over to draining the oil. All right, so here we are. We got our reasonably clean pan. It's nothing we're reusing, so I'm not that worried about there being a few little speckles of crap in here. I'm gonna invert this. Oil will start coming out, as will the fork spring. We don't want that to go splashing everywhere. So again, set that in line and orientation with the spring spacer, and if you have a spring spacer, definitely with the spring seat. Just keep that all in line and organized. Now we'll invert the fork, and we're just gonna start pumping this thing to get the old oil out, at least most of it. Also try stroking the damping rod if you can. That will get oil out of the cartridge as we stroke it, and the rebound circuit is able to work. Easy peasy. Now the The outer fork tube can still only go so far out. It's gonna wanna go pretty far, but this is kind of our next step anyway. See, right now it won't come apart. We'll get to that in a second. And actually decided for this next part to not put the fork back in the vise, but you can do this with next part with a screwdriver, or again, I have this Titan. It's like a cheap tool brand from O'Reilly's Auto Parts or something like that. You could do this with like a shorter flat blade screwdriver. I'll do that just because it's probably what most of you will have. Take the flat blade, softly try and wiggle and insert it underneath what's called the wiper seal. As you can see, this wiper seal is cracked all the way around. This bike sat around the side of the house, I think, for quite a while. So we'll remove that first. Once again, it's off camera, but right below here, we're keeping everything in line as they came apart. Now the next thing that's in here, it's a little dirty, so see you later, Cap. I'm gonna spray a little bit of that suspension cleaner in here around where the actual fork seal is. Before we can remove the fork seal, there's a spring clip in here that you pretty much just gotta get under, pry under. It's pretty easy to get to. There's a bunch of little curves and notches to make it easier. Just work around and up it'll come. Yeah, we got a little hanging on right there, but there it goes. There's some corrosion on that, so I'll be cleaning that up with like some Scotch-Brite or something. We'll just keep that in line with our other parts in disassembly. Probably pull out the bolt in the bottom. It comes right out. This isn't like other forks where it seems like you need to maintain spring tension or have a damping rod holding tool to get these out. They just come right out. So with that in mind, I just went off camera for that, but with that nut out the bottom and the springs already out, the whole cartridge will just come right out when you just pull that little nut that's in the bottom. From here, oh, we want to keep that where it belongs, don't we? On the end of the damping rod, or the cartridge. That was this little aluminum piece. It's what has, it doesn't have the threads, but it goes in the, on the bottom side of the cartridge, just like that. If that gets stuck in the bottom of your fork, that way you don't get confused on reassembly. And there you go. I recommend having rags around and stuff to set the critical internal parts on. But here we now have the fork tube, the inner tube that is. So we've already set the wiper seal, the seal retainer, the actual fork seal, and I'm pulling them all off and setting them down the same way so we don't get orientation wrong, because like the fork seal is directional, but this isn't a fork seal where you can just say, oh, I'll just put the side that has the internal spring on. That'll be facing inside. This has that in both directions. So that way's the bottom, that way's the top. Keep that in mind when you're taking them apart and putting them back together. There's a metal ring that goes here underneath the regular fork seal. There's the outer fork bushing, and then there's the inner fork bushing. And for this on the bottom, you just can pry apart with a screwdriver, or I just did with my fingernails and slid it off the end. And that's full disassembly. Now I'll show you my drying solution. So here's my drying, cleaning, draining stand setup I made. It's just a collection of PVC tubes and fittings in a bucket. Stuck them all together, and each suspension part is able to just stand on a post, and from here I can spray them and get all the dirt off, and then just let all the oil and crap drip into the bottom. So we're gonna kind of skip through that real quick, and then we'll go back to reassembly. Now that it's all in the pan, I think we can safely say that that fork oil is nasty. It was time. All right, so now with everything cleaned up, our next step will be to assemble the forks with, or the fork tubes with new bushings and seals. There's a little bit of rust in between the 2 points of the triple clamps. So I just took some basic high grit Scotch-Brite. Just kind of worked it around, cleaned it up, and then sprayed it off with that suspension clean. Now we're ready to go together. Get my hands wipe here. Got a little bit of fork oil here just for lubricating items, and otherwise this is pretty straightforward. I still have all my parts lined up in a row of how they came apart, and I'm pretty much just, as I put it together, I'll grab what parts I'm reusing, which are not very many. But we're starting here with our bottom fork bushing. New one's actually a different color than the original. Honda must have made that change for some reason. Hopefully it wasn't just a compromise of performance for cost. This is what we got. OEM Honda. So we slide that one on from the bottom right into the groove. The top one goes, or what we'll call the outer bushing, goes in from the top. And then, actually, you know what? Here's a good chance to kind of show you. So a little bit of rust here. Nothing crazy though, right? Just a little surface rust. From what I understand, this bike sat for a while, so a little moisture gets into places. Do that spray. All right. Slide our washer in. We have our new fork seal, and like I showed earlier, the bottom has the much wider visible groove. The top has the thinner groove, but both have a little spring in there. So don't just rely on the spring for orientation. Some seals you can do that. This is not one of those. In the absence of having what's called a seal bullet for this size, there is a little taper here on the end of the fork tube that'll help make things easier and smoother to go on. I'll just kind of load it from one side, get it started like you would a tire basically. There we go. So there's that. Here's the retainer that I had talked about. That still needs to be cleaned up. Again, just a quick rub in with some Scotch-Brite. It certainly looks good enough to me. So that goes in there. And then we will do the wiper seal in a minute. We don't really need that at the moment. In fact, we don't even actually want the retainer spring at the moment. Now we have outer fork tube. Coat everything in a little bit of oil here, just for assembly purposes. Ease of assembly, that is. Coat a little around the outside of the seal so it just slides into its groove more easily. I did not remove our little fork guard here. I didn't find that I needed to. So I'll just bottom out the fork tube itself. Drive in deep enough to where you can see a groove here, just like you did when you removed this ring. Sorry, gotta stand up the fork for a second. Get it started. As you work it in, just make sure you see it drop into that groove all the way around. Boom, there we go. That ain't coming apart. Now, the wiper seal. Put a little standard oil right here on the lip and the install surface. This is where I'm a fan of this Super Lube O-ring grease. a lot of people in the dirt bike world will put a little layer of grease basically here on the fork tube and then kind of spin the wiper seal as they put it on. That'll essentially catch oil up inside of here. Well, it'll catch grease up inside of here, which when any dust gets by the wiper seal, it'll get caught in the grease rather than getting down into your actual fork seal. So what I'm just gonna do is just a quick little schmutz of it there, smear it around the upper part of the seal. Anyway, that should just drop right in. There isn't even much tension to hold it. There, that's in. Now we'll move on to the cartridge. All right, so next we're going to install the cartridge unit again. We'll start by making sure that our spring seat is still there, and that this aluminum cone on the other fork tube I did, this actually stayed stuck in the bottom of the fork leg the whole time. I never actually got it out, but it was still able to just clean around it. This one, it just wanted to come out. So if you don't have it, make sure it's still in the bottom fork tube. If you do have it, make sure it's on there nice and secure. Same with the spring seat. Got our nut here on the end of the damping rod. We'll now slide it in. And I'll now have the tube compressed, and I'll just kind of press on the damping rod, try and help get it to seat in the bottom of the fork. Generally, in good light, I think you'd be able to kind of sight up from the bottom here. Yeah, and I can see the aluminum threads. So, we'll make sure our bolt is clean. Make sure that if you don't have a new washer, best thing you can kind of do is, once again, good old Scotch-Brite, just kind of give it a quick cleanup. There's no debris on it. Quick little bit of cleaner here. Make sure threads are nice and clean on the actual hardware. Okay. Grab our 6mm. Thread the 6mm into the end. It'll bottom out eventually if you got everything lined up. I'm not going to get crazy with tightening that right now. Maybe I might as well just do it all now, huh? Just so that we never forget. Give that a little leverage. Oh, nice and tight. Now, a tool that I like is the Tusk damping rod holding tool. It gives me a lot of extra leverage because right now the damping rod's way down in there. There it is. And for bleeding this cartridge, this is a real pain in the butt, having to reach all the way down the fork. So I have the M10 by 1 attachment on this rod. Thread that on. Up on the stand here. I'm sure you can see that, right? The manual from the information I was able to find on the internet for the 04 to 07 fork, which is different, I guess, from the 02 and 03. This one calls for 485 cc's or something like that, but it also gives you an oil level to set, okay? So it gives you a fluid level and a volume measurement. So rather than fuss over 10 little cc's here and there, I'm gonna go off of the height recommendation. I just put 500 cc's of Honda Pro Oil's suspension SS8 10 weight fork oil. We'll put this in here. I'm currently just holding the damping rod up with the fork tube slid all the way down. And I just kind of like to, with my ratio right, I press the end up against the damping rod and the fork. And that kind of prevents it, it kind of helps keep the speed of the flow under control.
Simple stuff. Now at this point, the fork oil is sitting very high in the tube. It's about right here. That's because there's still no oil down in the compression, or just even the, I was gonna say the compression part of the cartridge, but really the cartridge is just empty, period. So as I slowly just work the damper rod up and down, where we just keep seeing bubbles, we'll just continue to see them. Right now it's just sitting at the bottom of the stroke, and I just keep getting bloop, 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 bubbles all over the place. So we just gotta stroke this back and forth. On the other fork leg, this took a little while. I probably ended up stroking it like 20 times to get it to really fill the chamber. And how you'll be able to tell as you're doing this is there's essentially going to be a point where you feel damping, where you feel fluid that's passing through an orifice, and it's giving you a little resistance on the lift, and then boop, it'll go up easy. That's where there's still air. So I'm going down, I just hit resistance, bottomed out. Now as we go for rebound, right there, see, I had resistance, and then it goes, and I lose tension. We just got to keep working this back and forth until we have tension the whole time. As we're doing that, the fluid level's going down, 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 down. And we just keep seeing bubbles. Now, if you were doing this without a damping rod holding tool like this, the open exposed end of the damping rod will have oil flowing through it. If I was doing this, I should have safety glasses on right now. I don't, but as I'm doing this, if I didn't have something covering the end of the hole, I'd be getting a face full of oil. And suspension oil is very slippery, very messy stuff. I'd rather not have that happen to me or you. So at this point I have, I don't know how many strokes that was, maybe someone else counted. This one probably finished kind of quick, huh? We're just gonna pull this up and down until we stop seeing any bubbles, but at this point I feel damping force all the way through the compression and rebound parts of the stroke. I'm not really seeing many bubbles in there anymore, but it might be good practice to just let the fork sit for a minute and any bubbles can work their way out. I guess you could also maybe, some people do this with shocks when they're rebuilding, and just kind of with the plastic or rubber end of a screwdriver, just kind of tap around the body. And if there's any little cavities of air, people often hope that that'll help get it out. I don't think that did anything, but hey, we did it. All right, so at this point, I'm gonna leave the fork to sit just in the vise for a minute on our soft jaws, and then we'll work on finishing this up. So here we are with the fork tubes all reassembled, seals, all that's in. I still have my damping rod tool hooked up to the damping rod. This has been stroked and cleaned up real nice. We have the damping force up and down. This is sat, plenty of time to let the air come out. So one more step we have here, with the rod down, we have our oil level setting tool. So I guess this will be off camera, but I'm just taking my tape measure and setting this length. The spec from Honda for the 04 to 07 fork is 5.3 inches. So I'll just set that with my tape measure. And now with this set, we just go over our damping rod, and we just have to pull with the syringe until it stops. It's honestly a little hard to do. I wish I had a helper. It's kind of hard to pull on this syringe. There it goes. Okay, so we hit air at our 5.3 inches of depth. Now we're set there. Now our next bit is the fork spring. Looks like somebody's been inside this fork before, because as you can see, this is a progressively wound spring where it's softer down here, and then as the coils get further apart, the fork spring actually gets stiffer. And I also kind of figure that because most aftermarket springs are shorter than production springs, and you end up having to use a little spacer. So we go spring with the more tightly wound coils at the bottom. We have a washer. We have our spacer. And then we have our retaining collar here. So we can just slide all these down in there. That'll start taking up all the volume left behind in the fork. At this point, we pull this up and see it'll just drop right in. So we don't need our damping rod holding tool anymore. Take a wrench, just put it on the nut here at the bottom, just get that to break loose. So we're just about done here. Our fluid level is now set where it needs to be, because I think I shared, right? I did 500 cc's and then just assumed that the 14 cc's that needed to come out in accordance with the fluid level, that would all match up when I use the level tool. So we're gonna come back to what I was talking about with the rebound adjuster at the beginning. Where you set this screw, right now I have it backed all the way out, like you would on a dirt bike in a twin cartridge fork. If you install this right now as it is, the preload's backed all the way off, we just put this all back together. When I go to tighten that nut that holds the cap and adjuster assembly all together, and then we're done, where this stops in the thread on here and then locks together is actually based on where you set this screw. That was an interesting thing to me, because on the other fork tube, I initially had it just backed out, assembled it, and then I had no adjustment. I could feel that the needle was just seated in the bottom of the cartridge. So with a little bit of experimentation, first off I went and checked the other fork. Well, I have it written down here. I knew that I was at 1 to 1 1/4 turns out. So I put it back to there, assembled the cap again, and then discovered I had 1 inch to 1 1/4 inch of adjustment total. So what that tells me is that the position of the rebound adjuster at assembly pretty much sets the amount of adjustability that you have. Now this fork came apart at 2 1/2 turns, so that's what we're going to set it at again, and then we will assemble it and set it at the 1 1/4 turnout. We're just going to set it at 1. That's what it calls for in the factory service manual. So 1/2, 1, 1 1/2, 2, 2 1/2 turns. Now we'll assemble it. Now remember, the cap position in relation to the rebound adjuster really doesn't matter. Basically, we just have that backed off all the way right now. Oh, wrong wrench. We just have that, like I'm holding the cap and then turning back on the rebound adjuster, nothing, but it'll go tighter. But I have that set all the way loose. And now I'm just going to run this down. It stopped pretty much right there. There's still 1/4 inch or so of thread there. Take this wrench here, this wrench on the preload adjuster, and that's them locked together. Maybe we give them a little more snug just to be good. I thought that was pretty good, but there we go. So at this point, we're able to just thread the cap back on. We're going to be done. I'm going to put the soft jaws back in the vise to hold this. I'm currently using some rags and just on one of the tabs on the fork. I thought on the lower tube that was a good way to hold it right now. I should really just get a set of aluminum soft jaws altogether, but that's just not quite tight enough. Now, when I put the fork in the vise like this, I like to put the vise jaws pretty much in the same spot that the fork tube would otherwise be grabbing. I'm sorry, the fork tube would be getting grabbed by the triple clamp.
All right. We already tightened the nut on the bottom. So that's it. From here, we just reset our clickers to where we started. Right now I have it turned in all the way, right? So now we just gotta go 1/2, 1. And we are at 7 turns from all the way out on spring preload. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Do that a second time, and that's rebuilding forks on a Honda CB 900 or 919 Hornet.